Okay. So just going through the agenda for today's webinar, we have a very exciting agenda. Today our webinar is much focused on the industry perspective. So we have 5 very different perspectives from the industry sector. Each presentation will have 10 minutes followed by a 5 minutes Q&A that you can use Mentimeter to place your questions, and we'll have a 5-minute break followed by the discussion part, which will be moderated by Mario Ravic. So, and welcome to everyone that is arriving. I would like just to quickly introduce myself. My name is Vanessa Mendes. I'm a health project manager at the shared service of the Ministry of Health in Portugal, which is a partner institution of the project European mHealth Hub, which is promoting this webinar. So I will just give you a brief welcome and a little bit about the work that we are developing for the hub. So as you all know, the mHealth ecosystem has different sectors and actors involved. We have health social care, policy makers, insurance, and the very heart, the citizens and the patients. And the prior talks, which are, you can actually rewatch them, have been focusing different sectors. But this is actually the first one that we focus on the industry perspective. And this is an ongoing effort of the European mHealth project to create this discussion around mHealth and create a platform, a trust platform for a community around mHealth where they can share expertise, knowledge, and actually cooperate together. So this is one of our efforts, and that's why this is so focused on the industry perspectives to capture their challenge and opportunities around mHealth. And with that, I will also talk a little bit one of our works, because one key recommendation that we see is actually involving all the stakeholders, because the private sector is a big player in the mHealth ecosystem. And this work that I'm presenting you here, which is the deliverable about policy framework that is trying to contribute to develop a policy framework for EU on cross-border adoption and assessment of innovation in mHealth. This is going to be published very soon in this link, and you can access later on. So I just wanted to go through a little bit what we have done. I'm not going to present in detail, but we have conducted interviews with different representatives of the Ministry of Health that have been involved in either an mHealth or any health strategy. And as you can see in the screen, we have captured very different countries. We have very different realities and are at different stage of the policy implementation. And one thing, for example, that we notice is that normally countries don't have a specific mHealth strategy, but rather a e-health strategy that integrates mHealth in it, with the exception being the region of Catalonia in Spain, which actually has participated before in the hub talk. They saw the need to have a standalone because they had a very specific need to develop the strategy, but even them are now actually moving forward and thinking about incorporating the e-health strategy. And of course, we have much more analysis from these interviews. Then we also have defined what we call them the 8 main strategic policy areas that comprehend the shared expertise and knowledge of the European mHealth Hub, which is in this first column. I'm not going to dive in too much in this webinar, but for each of these policies, we have explored different strategies and use case initiatives to extract recommendation. And as you can see, there are very, very different examples across Europe. And this collective information was what we used to design the European mHealth Hub policy framework that has at its very core these 8 main policy areas, and is focused on the 4 main policy phases, which is formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation monitoring. So what we did was, and I'll pass it here, per policy area and per policy phase, we have collected several processes, which is a high level of what you need to do, and evolve them into streams of actions which are represented by procedures, with the main purpose of actually providing clear examples and recommendations that can support policy implementers and policymakers and implementers. But of course, all the actors of the ecosystem are important in this exercise. And I just wanted to share some of the recommendations that we have, which this is very high level, but as I mentioned, involving all stakeholders of the mHealth ecosystem, from the inception to the implementation to during the evaluation. And this is very, very important, not only to obtain a more comprehensive approach, but to actually increase the likelihood of adoption, which a lot of times actually fail. Another is finding that we have is promoting synergies between strategies that exist inside of the country, because different sectors can quite be important to interact, such as there are countries that have a specific digitalization sectors, and it's very important, and it's especially combined with international cross-border efforts, because this is a way to have a close collaboration between countries, which is considered important to advance the mHealth, the global mHealth, and make it accessible across countries. And of course, with that comes promoting common interoperability standards, because this is the way to achieve harmonization across our Europe. And again, including all the stakeholders in this process and providing them guidance, not only defining, but telling them and helping them implement it. And of course, we hope with this deliverable to provide a framework that promotes a collaborative and inclusive mHealth policy that ultimately benefits users and healthcare systems across Europe. This framework was designed to have a dynamic approach that can be tailored to a country or region specific needs, provides, as I mentioned, key recommendations, and we hope to be a useful resource that can be leveraged for the development of health strategies and promote their adoption and build connection between countries. And taking again about the community, and I really like this sentence that says a community is a group of people who agree to grow together, because sharing knowledge is growing together, makes us more stronger. And that's why we're currently developing a new platform for the European, which is basically a platform for the community, where you can share learning materials, either for experts or non-experts. And we also have a forum where the community can come together. And I'm actually going to show you how it works. This is not yet available. This is in development, but it's quite advanced, as you can see. It's a very intuitive platform. You can log in. You just need an email and a password. This is the main page. And here you can see the latest content that it has been added. And this will be, as you're seeing, it's very different content. Related, of course, with mHealth, and it's built to be for experts and non-experts, because we want to bring the community together. In this page, which is about, we dive in, explain a little bit more and how to actually use. This is based on WordPress and it's very easy to use. And then in here, this is the learning materials. We have different categories. Of course, this will increase over time. Just to give an example, for example, we have already 3 cases related with funding and reimbursement models. This is more on the European level, types of funding that are available, and right now there's a lot of advancements in this direction. Then we have, for example, the German and the mHealthBelgium. We actually have a representative here that will talk later on. And then you can actually contribute, and I'm just logging in for you to see. And going back to the site. So you can actually contribute to the platform. You just have to create a new post and just write here what you want to add and promote in our platform. And here you can click a category, or you can actually suggest one. And after you publish, will be for us to evaluate just the formatting and have it more pretty, let's say, for the platform, and then it becomes public. And of course, you will be aware of that. And then we have the fun part, which is the forum. I don't believe there's any forum like this for the mHealth community. And of course, eHealth is all more than welcome, because it's very intertwined with mHealth. This is very easy again to use. You just have to create a new post. These will be published directly, just like every forum. And then I'll just press here just to see. And here you just have a brief summary, and here you can explore. This is just a news that France is following a similar model as the German for app reimbursement. And here there's a category associated. So as you see, this is really for the community, and we hope to have you on board and participate with us. So I'll just back to the presentation. So before moving to our speakers, I just wanted to let you know, just in the meantime, you can open Menti. you can use this code, and we use this platform to collect the questions for our speakers. So please go open so that you have it prepared for placing your questions. And now let me just come back here. So I'd like to thank you, and now I'm going to pass the word to our first speaker, which is Danny van, let me just pass here. Danny van Roijen is currently the Digital Health Director at COCIR, which is a leading industry voice in Europe on digital health, representing medical imaging, radiotherapy, electromedical, and health IT industries. Danny has been focused on European policy making, especially on topics such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, cybersecurity, data protection, interoperability, and mHealth, and that's why one of the topics for today. He's also been participating in different e-health stakeholders groups, even in the European Commission, and has participated in several EU-funded projects, and actually have collaborated with Danny even for this project. And Danny, thank you once again for accepting to be here today. It's a great pleasure for us, and I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Vanessa, and for this kind invitation. And indeed, we have been following this initiative from the beginning. We think it's a very interesting project, and thanks for offering the opportunity to present some views today on the mHealth situation currently ongoing. So in today's presentation, I will mainly focus on some aspects we have been working on, which is the interoperability aspect. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So within COCIR, we have different working groups, and we have one very active group looking into interoperability. So earlier this year, we have done a publication of a white paper where we focus in specific on the interoperability for effective mHealth deployment. We all know that there's quite an interest from the community, both from the demand and supply side, when it comes to mHealth applications. And clearly this interest also means that a lot of resources are going into this area. It is, however, important that we ensure we have proper interoperability for all these solutions, so that we don't waste the time and resources that have been put into these applications. As a kind of first white paper that we put out on this, we looked towards what is necessary, what is a kind of best practice for setting up an mHealth project. And there we have also worked together with IHE Europe, who is kind of working on the profiling and try to integrate interoperability standards into the daily application. So within our white paper, we also have a few examples of concrete mHealth use cases where the IHE profiles can be used to share or exchange data between different healthcare providers, professionals, but also with the patient. So within this paper, we focus on a number of things that we feel are important when setting up an mHealth project. First of all, to collaborate with the ecosystem, to make clear specifications around the use cases and the kind of profiles and standards that are needed to ensure interoperability among the different systems. We also feel it's quite important to focus more on education of the different stakeholders, both on the demand and supply side, and then as well, of course, identify what is necessary to move forward. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is also what we set out as our recommendations in this white paper. So quite clearly, we need collaboration with the different levels, both at the member state level as well as at EU level. And I'm happy to see that the European mHealth Hub has contributed to this overall dialogue, and I'm also looking forward to some of the presentations of my colleagues later in the session. There's a need for stakeholder engagement and come up with some very useful use cases to define, as mentioned, the interoperability specifications, referencing the industry or international standards that are being used to ensure you have proper interoperability, and then based on the priority use cases, identify as well the organizational and policy changes needed to effectively deploy and foster the implementation of those mHealth solutions. Now, if you could go to the next slide, I would like to focus on something else, which was also subject of another publication we did earlier this year, and that relates to FHIR. FHIR has been gaining a lot of momentum within the community and is sort of like the buzzword when it comes to interoperability. Within this white paper, we try and create awareness around the use of FHIR because it does not provide interoperability out of the box. So there are some caveats with regards to the current coding technology. So what we find as some of the current limitations or issues around FHIR is that it's still to a certain extent limited in its standardization. We only have been working for the last few years with more normative standards, which means that basically older applications or implementations may be based on trial use standards, which creates compatibility issues. We also have a kind of fragmented reality where there are a lot of different applications, and FHIR in itself, it's pretty practical and easy to work with. It also means that everyone can come up with its own definitions. So it does lead to a kind of fragmentation on the use of definitions. And also, if we look into the longer term, there can be some questions around the sustainability or the maintenance of the code that is being done. Next to that, FHIR in itself does not solve all. So quite clearly, the forte of FHIR is that it is highly customizable. At the same time, it means that you may encounter some difficulties, let's say, in covering the last mile for the implementation. Also, when it comes to workflow implementation, clearly there are some issues, and there's a need to further incorporate FHIR into, for instance, IHE profiles, and they have some FHIR-based profiles. And then for the developer community as well, it is not always easy because a lot is going on to kind of determine what is worthwhile to contribute to.
Yo también.
Sorry.
We are
So at the same time, clearly there are some strong foundations, and we think it will be more and more robust over time. There's also more and more focus coming from the demand side and also from governments in focusing on interoperability aspects and the role FHIR can play in that. And as mentioned, there's a lot of buzz in the community. So a lot of developers are moving towards FHIR. It also has a lower barrier than some of the more traditional technologies within healthcare. So quite clearly, we see there's a strong future for FHIR, but we need to make sure that people have a better understanding of its limitations and its best use. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we have a number of recommendations, both to the demand side and more specific as well to the European Commission and the member states. First of all, to further update the endorsement of IHE profiles. It is not very much known, but a couple of years the European Commission endorsed a number of IHE profiles for public procurement processes. Then next to that, and we hope that the discussions around the European health data space will also put this in a more firmer framework, that there will be kind of interoperability roadmap so that everyone is sort of moving into the same direction and that we can bundle resources to improve interoperability in the field. Also some more international or global convergence and discussions would be helpful. And clearly there should also be a need for testing environments. We see there are certainly some initiatives coming from the standardization community, for instance, IHE recently set up a 24/7 testing environment called Curaizon, and at the same time, IHE, FIRE, and others are organizing projectathons and hackathons to sort of do real-life testing of developed solutions. If you could go to the next slide, please. We also have some recommendations for the vendors and the developer community to ensure that they sort of try and focus on those standards that are being used and worked on at a more harmonized and global level, so that we don't have any local or regional divergences that may undermine the overall interoperability within and across member states. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And that is just the final point of my presentation. That is another publication that we did about 1 year ago, where we looked into the current situation for market access for digital solutions, including mHealth. And when we thought market access, we mainly focused on the reimbursement process. So I will not go into details because I'm sure Stephen and the others have plenty to say on that. But also there we feel that interoperability should be an important aspect that needs to be considered when talking about the market access and reimbursement processes for mHealth solutions. And we're happy to see that this is already the case for the DIGA in Germany and for the mHealthBelgium system. But looking into the European upscaling, of course, we appreciate more dialogue in looking into harmonizing these requirements. And with that, I'll leave it for now. I'm very much looking forward to the other presentations and discussion. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Lenny. I'm just going to shift the screen to the Mentimeter. So, okay, we have a question. Oh, okay, that was for me. I'll answer that one later. Do please, I'm not sure if anyone is posting on the webinar. But in the meantime, I'll ask some questions. I feel like, and I'm a 1 year in digital health person, and to me, it looks like making interoperability an issue of the past is still a long way to go, and there are many efforts, but still a long road. And I think you have touched on a topic that is guidance, and I feel like sometimes countries just say, we state, Portugal, I state these are the specifications, and then France will state there's other specifications, Belgium will state there are different specifications. And I know COCIR has developed a lot of work on that. What has been for you one of that main challenge to actually promote this harmonization?
Well, of course, we have to be aware of the fact that healthcare in itself, it's kind of local issue. It's like waste and some other things where quite clearly there's a very national and regional competence, because it needs to be quite close to the people, and there's a lot of history and tradition in providing care. So that, of course, creates a certain organizational challenge in how to do that. At the same time, however, we see that in the past, both from the demand and supply side, interoperability was not considered essential or a priority. So we need to make sure that we put the necessary drivers in place so that we can have a turnaround around this. What we see is very useful is that we have, for instance, the eHealth network, which so far in its activities has mainly focused on interoperability issues, where they have come up with certain guidelines, including procurement, but where I think it's necessary we get to a more practical level, as from our experience and perception, this is not fully taken up. And we need to have a more closer dialogue as well with the payers and actually the healthcare providers and professionals that are procuring also the solutions. So we need to work at different levels. At the same time, I'm not unaware of the difficulties within industry itself. The ecosystem is quite complex, also very local. We see a lot of influx from general software developers who may not be aware of the specific healthcare environment or standardization. So there we have also been working on some initiatives And I would like to point out, and I will drop a link in the chat. On the one hand side, recently together with mHealth Europe, we have put out a white paper that provides also some overview on interoperability in digital health, which can be of interest to people. And another element, and this has just come to conclusion, was the EU-funded project called Digital Health Europe, where as one of the deliverables, kind of spin-off website has been established, which also provides information on standardization, interoperability within healthcare as such. So I will drop these links in the channel because I think they might be useful in sort of guiding people towards the right level of knowledge and reference documents and organizations.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for you have been a great contributor for sure for this issue that affects, and as you mentioned, is also very at the local level, and it's not an easy challenge. The more I understand why it's so difficult to suppress. But we are not in the first step. We have done a lot of steps, and I think we are in the right path. So with that, I'll just share my screen. Danny, you can interact with, of course, our audience in the chat box, and we'll see you back in the discussion session. So I'll just present again. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'd like now to introduce Matthew Prime. He is the head of evidence generation at Roche Information Solutions. He actually has spent 12 years in clinical practice as an orthopedic surgeon in London, in UK, I'm sorry. He also has a PhD in healthcare policy focused on enablers and barriers for digital health innovation in UK. And in 2013, he also co-funded a digital health company to digitalize care coordination for patients with traumatic injuries. And he actually been deployed in 20% of UK hospitals, which is actually very important. And he's working in Roche since 2018. Again, Matthew, thank you so much for accepting to be here in our webinar. I'm looking forward to your presentation, and I'll pass the floor to you.
Thanks very much. So can you hear me all right? I'll take that as a yes. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I'm going to cover some of the challenges around evidence generation for digital health. So when I talk about evidence generation, what that means is really how one demonstrates a relative advantage of the solution that's being deployed. So that's actually particularly difficult if you follow traditional paradigms of evidence generation, which I'm going to try and illustrate. So if I could go to the next slide. Could I go to the next slide?
It's been changed. Can you not see it?
Oh, it's not come yet. Maybe the one after that.
Okay. This is changing.
Okay. I can only see the title slide, which is...
Okay, let me just launch it again, and maybe it will help. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Oh, I think maybe, is anyone else not seeing it? Could you write on we see the slide. I think it's a connection issue in your side, Matthew.
Okay, shall I?
Do you think you can open your slides maybe to go through them? And just let me know, and I'll share with the folks here.
Okay, well, you tell me what slide you're on, and I'll probably...
So we are on in the digital health environment, solutions need to satisfy the needs of all key.
Sure, okay. So, yes, as the title says, you know, when you're working in digital health, and this is broader than just mHealth, but when you're working in digital health, solutions need to satisfy the needs of all the key stakeholders and deliver them shared value. So I think that there are three key stakeholders. The first is the end user, and that can be the patient, that could be a clinician, that could be a nurse, and that could be a family member. The regulator or the notified body, that's obviously a clear stakeholder one needs to demonstrate evidence to. And then the purchaser of the solution. And again, that could be different groups. So that could be a patient as an individual purchasing an application, or it could be a health system, or for that matter, a payer system. So each of those users need similar but not the same types of evidence. So if you're an end user, you want to make sure that this solution is usable, that it has a benefit for you, potentially an operational benefit or an outcome benefit. As a regulator, it's much more around the quality and the safety of the solution and the clinical association that that solution has to the condition. And then from a purchaser perspective, one wants to make sure that there is some form of return on investment. So very much they're looking for evidence around cost effectiveness. And actually, most of the time, these are three separate groups. It's very uncommon that the end user is also the purchaser. It's likely that the end user is a patient, where the purchaser of the solution is a health system. So I think there is a kind of sweet spot in the middle where you can try and demonstrate benefits of improved experience, clinical benefit, operational efficiency, and economic value. And if you're able to do that and show this relative advantage, you satisfy the needs of all the key stakeholders. Can I go to the next slide? Just tell me when you're on the next slide, because I can't see it. So
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, it's already there.
okay. And I don't have the slides in front of me, so I'm trying to talk from memory at the moment. So could you just tell me the title of this?
Yeah, value generation is shifting from a linear to a multimodal system and is supported by underlying evidence.
Sure. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make on this slide is that if you take the traditional paradigm that exists in health and life science businesses, is before a product is released. So let's take a drug. If I look at the company I work in, Roche, which is a pharmaceutical business or has a pharmaceutical business as a component, the whole way the company is structured is around creating evidence of value of a product. So in the you have the kind of discovery groups that are looking for new molecules, then you have the development groups that are taking these molecules through clinical trials, and then you have the kind of commercial groups. The transition all the way along is incremental demonstration of evidence, and only when the evidence satisfies the regulated bodies would one take a drug to market and be sure that that's safe and providing a benefit. In the digital health environment, we have a completely different paradigm. So what's happening in digital health is that if you're making an mHealth solution, an app, or some form of workflow solution, you can't create evidence of the benefits of this solution until it actually exists. And so that means that once people be aware, you have a sort of technical launch for a product, and then over time you iterate and continuously develop until you get to something that can be really commercially launched. So between the technical launch and the commercial launch, you want to be able to deploy and get feedback from potential end users. And this period is a really challenging period. The development can happen very quickly. And so when you're trying to create evidence, you have to be very responsive and fast to what you're trying to show. Could I move to the next slide?
Yes. So now is established evidence generation along the product life cycle.
Yeah, okay. So on this slide, this has a framework for the types of evidence that one might need to generate along the product maturity life cycle. So this is actually a framework developed by the World Health Organization and published in 2016. It's something that I think is incredibly easy to use and understand. But basically, before you even launch a product, you really need to make sure you're solving a problem, and that by solving that problem, you deliver a relative advantage. You also need to understand the nuances of how your product works in different markets, because the fundamental system of interaction is not, if you take a drug, where that drug is interacting is the human body. That's the system it's interacting. That is essentially common across all people in the world. If you think about how an mHealth solution might work, its fundamental system of action is actually the health system, which is an aggregation of different people and their behaviors. So because systems and behave differently and are structured differently, you really have to identify whether the mHealth solution you have works in that system. So that's the initial scoping part. Once you have created a product, there's some form of prototype or a minimally viable product. In the early stages of this product, you can only really establish that it's functional and stable and that it has usability. And as you continually iterate and develop, then you can start to test things like efficacy and effectiveness. And ultimately, you can, as the product becomes more mature, you can start to explore reasons why it's not been adopted. Now, I keep efficacy and effectiveness separate, and the reason for that is efficacy is really exploring something in a controlled environment. So that's in a pilot site or simulation, which is something I'm going to illustrate in a minute. Effectiveness is how does this behave in a complex, fast-paced, real-world clinical environment, and they're two very different kind of spaces. Fundamental to all of this is really understanding the regulatory strategy, and that really needs to be established up front, because one needs to know whether clinical evaluations need to be undertaken. And I can tell you from bitter experience, trying to go backwards and do a clinical evaluation is a very complex process. The other thing that people need to bear in mind is how does one demonstrate economic value? And so in the early stages, that's really understanding the problem and creating some form of assumption model, and then working out with your efficacy and effectiveness studies how you can assess what the product you're evaluating actually impacts. Can I go to the next slide? So I really feel that there's a huge challenge for evidence generation for digital health, and for that matter, mHealth. I think that the traditional methods we have for evidence generation, particularly if you come from a pharmaceutical company mindset of randomized control trials, are just fundamentally misaligned with the agile approaches to software development. You know, we have this technical launch, we can rapidly iterate the product, we can fix the bugs, we can pivot the product if the use case doesn't work. Ultimately, we wouldn't be able to really do an RCT until that product is stable. And then that may take years. And by the time you actually even have evidence of benefit, the product's fundamentally out of date. So this traditional methods just don't work. Now, we made a comment at the start, Vanessa, about actually adoption often fails. And I think that healthcare providers really need to see evidence of products before they're prepared to adopt. But here the paradox is that if you haven't got some form of adoption somewhere, it's really difficult to generate evidence of your product. So this is a paper that we published in Nature Digital Medicine at the end of last year, really saying that we need to explore different methodologies for how we generate pragmatic, innovative, and high quality evidence for products. So I'll move to the next slide. You might have to, we're on the next slide. So this is a method that we've been exploring about how we can use simulation to test our products. So for those perhaps not familiar with simulation, simulation-based research is a kind of foundation for human behavior experimental research. And it's really common in healthcare. So it's really common in medical training, and it's really common in continuous professional development. I think, as Vanessa kindly mentioned, I originally trained as an orthopedic surgeon. And when you learn to stitch, you don't immediately practice on patients. You practice on an orange because it feels a little bit like stitching human skin. So that gives you a really nice way to test the instruments, to get a feel for how to tie knots. Many high-income countries have, big hospitals in high-income countries will have very advanced simulation laboratories. So as you become more experienced, and in my case, you have to manage acute trauma, we need to be certified with an acute trauma life support certificate. That's a 2-3 day course, and there we can do quite in-depth simulation. So it's already used widely in healthcare. The key assumption behind simulation-based research is that people will behave similar to real-life scenarios if key components of that scenario are extracted and the fidelity is maintained. And we've run a number of these types of studies now, and what we really find is critical is making sure that the scenario is real. So if I'm doing a solution around making a decision, that we have to make sure that clinical problem is real. You have to have representative end users. So if it's a product for an oncologist, you need to test it with an oncologist, and that person who's the subject in the test really needs to understand how the solution works. But the benefits are that because you're doing it in a simulated way, you don't really need to implement this solution into the hospital IT infrastructure. Taking a new solution and trying to implement it into a hospital to do a pilot can take many, many months of going through information governance. Here you can bypass that because you are running a simulation. And the other thing is we tend to use synthetic data, so we're not using real patient data, and that avoids any privacy concerns. And some of the feedback we've got from clinicians is that they very much like this approach as a way to test products before they might want to adopt them. And from our perspective, we can get some incredibly granular information about how people are interacting with the product and also the overall benefits. So I'll go on to the next slide.
I've changed it.
You might have to tell me the title of this one.
Final thoughts.
Okay, so my final thoughts, I think how I organized those was, I think there's a real balance. I think it's incredibly important that innovators and industry demonstrates evidence of the benefits of their product. We really have to be able to show the relative advantage, and that will give confidence to people who are adopting these solutions that they work. But the balance is we need to take a very pragmatic approach on what types of evidence are appropriate. Because if the expectation is for complex RCTs, then the wider community needs to be aware that that takes quite a lot of time. Now, whilst in a company like mine, we would potentially have the capabilities to do that, it comes at an increased cost. So the solution would potentially come at an increased cost, and it may not be viable. If you're in a smaller company or a startup, some of the very high evidence barriers will just completely stop them being able to bring a product to market. So that's the kind of general theme. From an evidence perspective, I think we really need to take a pragmatic approach as to what's acceptable, and simulation may have a place to play there. I think I make a comment on this slide, and apologies because I can't see it, around funding. And for me, I think, as you highlighted, I've been in this space for a while. Funding has always been a real issue, so it was great to hear that there are some initiatives there. I think there's funding for solutions, but I also think there needs to be funding put aside to enhance kind of ICT infrastructure in hospitals. My experience of implementing products in my former days in a startup was that the infrastructure we were trying to integrate or deploy solutions into was just incredibly poor. And that actually made it almost impossible. And then the final thing is around education and training. And so here, I think it's really important we start to upskill clinical staff. Excuse me. And I think that actually has to happen at medical school, because I think we really have to explain to medical students and junior doctors around what the benefits of mHealth and digital health are. Unfortunately, for my colleagues who are already fully practicing consultants, they are rather stuck in their ways. So they find it very difficult to adopt these solutions. So I think we need to start early. And then the other thing is just a reflection on, creating space for change. This famous kind of concept introduced by Donald Berwick. And you can't expect clinicians in hugely busy frontline clinical hospitals to adopt workflow change and new solutions. So we have to think about ways and places where we can help them understand the benefits of the solution and implement in a kind of sympathetic, empathetic way. So I think I'm going to finish there and see if anyone has any questions. Vanessa, you might have to tell me what the questions are because I can't see anything.
Yes. I think there's actually a comment on the chat. Actually, we might take the question from there as well, and I'll see. Okay, so I have Marian here that he says, do you think we have a workable, practical classification of tissues tools agreed by both regulated purchasers? Can you share some examples? Thank you.
So do I think we have a workable classification? I think the classification's only workable if the people that have to, make the decisions about it are happy with it. So, if we know who is the purchaser in different institution and they're happy with the classification, then it works. If we come and we come top down, say this is the classification and this is what you have to do, I think my experience of being, as it were, on the front line is that that's not necessarily accepted. So that would be the first comment. And what was the second part of that question?
Can you share some examples, I think? And actually, maybe you can move to the other one. Mark is asking, will the MRD serve that purpose?
NRD or MDR?
I think it's the medical. Mark, can you explain the MDR? Yes, the medical device regulation.
Yeah, okay, so I can talk a bit about that. So with MDR, we're actually finding it a little bit tricky to interpret as to exactly what's required. So MDR really only applies for the regulated products. And so there are a whole host of products that technically are not, they're regulated, but they don't have to submit anything. So workflow products, products that aggregate and display data. So MDR does serve a purpose for clinical evaluations, and there is guidance within that, but it is very much for regulated products. My general observation is that very, very few digital health products go through that process. Most people try and circumvent the regulations, and there are a variety of ways people are doing that. I also, just as a comment on MDR, I'm not just dealing in the European market, so I'm dealing in all global markets. And there is definitely a divergence happening between MDR and FDA. And that makes it pretty difficult if you're trying to create studies to demonstrate evidence. So I think there needs to be some more alignment. And just be aware, if there's a divergence, people will then concentrate their efforts on the markets where it's a little bit clearer and where the barrier is a little bit lower.
Okay, and we have, I'll let later for you to see Marian, which is agreeing with you. I'll just take one last question for Mentimeter that says most digital solutions are improved based on feedback from users. In a highly regulated environment, how can we rapidly, incrementally improve digital health solutions that are already on the market without overburdening developers and regulators?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and there's loads of different sort of takes me in loads of different directions. So the first one is I think that it is possible to collect better metrics from products. So you can collect the aggregated insights of how a user's interacting with the products, and you can actually see what they click on, what they like, what they don't like, and that can guide product development. That's one way that you can do it in a sort of passive data collection way. I think the second point I would make is we shouldn't really be developing and deploying solutions onto a market or into environments without having developed them alongside users. Because, if you develop with users and with key sites, you're much likely to kind of get nearer to what the product needs to deliver the first time round. That's in a kind of this sort of not particularly regulated space. When the product is regulated, you have to notify when you change things, and there may be the underlying factor of what the algorithm, for example, is doing, but there's also the interaction between that algorithm and the user interface, and so the user interface then becomes integral to how this is interpreted, so changing it becomes much more complicated. So then it's hard to incrementally improve. Yeah, that's something that's a high burden and quite difficult.
Okay, thank you so much. We can still interact in the chat, but in the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce the next speaker. We have Nicholas James Rumble, which is the founder and CEO of Curaizon. It's a medtech company, and I'll let Nicholas introduce and explain better Curaizon. Nicholas actually has a background in mathematics, economics, and engineers, and spent much of his working life in investment banking before actually moving to healthcare technology almost 10 years ago. He's very focused and passionate about reducing the enormous issues related with drug non-adherence, which is actually the backbone of Curaizon. And he has more than 25 years of business experience, having successfully created and exited technology-based startups. So we have now a very startup perspective. And Nicholas, I want to thank you once again for accepting to be here, and I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It's a pleasure to be here and alongside some esteemed colleagues. I actually mirror an awful lot of what Matt had to say, so really interesting that minds are meeting on these issues. Can you see my screen okay, Vanessa? Anyone? Beulah?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So, as Vanessa was kind enough to mention, I'm the founder and CEO of Curaizon. I'm just going to run you through a few slides here. So a very brief introduction to our company. Curaizon has pioneered adherence technology that's embedded into primary care and pharmaceutical clinical trials. We create the first of its kind data and reporting for adherence, behavior, usage and outcomes. And this data is used really to improve the lives of the millions of people that are suffering from long-term and chronic illness. I only have 10 to 12 minutes, so I'll be covering these topics from a 10-kilometer view, but happy to discuss these in more detail at a later date should anyone wish to reach out and speak to me directly about them. So the elephant in healthcare, the technology elephant in healthcare, the old fable of the blind men and the elephant is quite appropriate when we think about how technology is seen from different perspectives by those in healthcare. This is especially true when it comes to regulatory requirements. So for example, where software is still classified as a device, we don't feel this is appropriate or helpful. In fact, this is actually quite a lazy approach by the regulators. So these different perspectives without clarification or standardization has led to confusion and missed opportunities within this space specifically. Technologically speaking, healthcare lags behind anywhere between 10 and 15 years compared to other sectors. This is compared to industries such as finance, military, automotive, logistics, mobile, and so on and so forth. An example of this is machine learning and artificial intelligence have been used in these sectors for almost 20 years, but it's only now coming to the forefront in primary care. The lack of accountability or the need to be competitive means that there are few drivers, such as those in commercial environments, where there's a very real arms race, literally in the case of military. So lagging behind is usually a function of poor change management. And having said this, rapid change in and of itself can be too disruptive. And we think this is where technology companies can play an important role, because they're able to disrupt from the outside and then deliver quietly in the background. And there's obviously challenges in and around that, but I don't have time to go into those today. Bureaucracy kills innovation. Well, that's something that we're all fairly familiar with, I would have thought. Sometimes it feels as though doing nothing is the safest option. That's oftentimes the case within bureaucratic environments, that keeping it as the status quo is the safest way to move forward. However, really doing nothing is not an option. But we know this is often what happens, or actually doesn't happen in reality. The main problem as we see it is that the issues plaguing healthcare services are not going away and can't be fixed with band-aid style approaches. In fact, the issues are growing. We have an aging population, we have rising chronic disease, we have fewer healthcare professionals in many cases. All of these are leading to spiraling healthcare costs. For us, the good news is that stakeholders are now more than ever less willing to accept doing nothing. So we have some light at the end of the tunnel, as I see it. This is really positive news for technology companies entering the market right now. So the data-driven age is upon us, and many countries are now willing participants in that. And we see it as these early adopters will really be the drivers of adoption elsewhere. So within the European setting, countries are watching each other very closely to see what each are doing, and oftentimes mimicking and copying and leading where others, following where others have led, which is again another important driver of innovative growth in this sector. There's no James Bond special branch run by the health service equivalent of Q sitting in the basement creating amazing technologies, I'm sorry to say. Healthcare systems are notoriously poor at delivering viable tech themselves, so they need nimble, innovative companies to help them realize digitization goals and achieve greater efficiencies. They need us, so they have to find a way to help us, as I see it. The existing cost model will make it very difficult for the financial demands of healthcare going forwards unless waste is reduced. This is something that Curaizon is very focused upon. In reality, the healthcare services do an amazing job of treating patients and providing care, and we need to empower these frontline workers to continue doing this incredibly important work by providing the technology and the tools as well that help augment that role. So we think that letting healthcare professionals be healthcare professionals and letting technologists be technologists is a way forward here. New technologies really need to reduce the cost of care, but not at the expense of the patient. Technology needs to improve quality of care and patient outcomes while simultaneously reducing cost and waste within the system, something that we're all acutely aware of, I'm quite sure. And then really aligning those expectations from the perspectives of those blind men standing around the elephant is a really important and critical success point. So existing procurement pathways represent huge investments in cost and time, and we have something like an approximately 1% success rate, which is very poor. The issue as we see it is that if you expect, just because you comply with regulatory frameworks and licensing and other issues in and around there, that this will guarantee you market access and success, that's almost never the case. And we think that this really has to change, and there's a lot that we can do here. The systems are fragmented and disparate and rarely communicate with one another. And one of the risks that we see time and again when we're talking to different European markets in particular is that as healthcare services try to improve procurement pathways, all they end up doing is adding layers of complexity, and this again will just kill innovation. An example of this is the UK's National Health Service has more than 10 official procurement pathways, which is just way too much. And if we look at another example of a procurement system that was designed from the ground up with really good intentions, but we think has largely failed in reality, this is Germany's DIGA. So as of, I think, April this year, there have been 72 submissions of new technologies. 15 of these have been approved, 6 of these were for mental health. So based on this ratio, then we're likely to see more than 500 different technologies emerging over the coming years, often for the same problem. This isn't sustainable because doctors simply can't educate themselves on this many technologies and then stay up to date with these existing as well as new technologies entering the market. This is evidenced by the fairly low level of uptake by these these technologies by doctors in Germany. And another example of this is that in the UK, I think we have something like 1,600 or 1,800 approved drugs, and the average doctor knows only 40 of them. And this really highlights the issue of doctors that have a very busy schedule in delivering care to their patients don't have the time to stay abreast of latest technologies, therapeutics, and so on. So it's really important that we find a more streamlined way of presenting this. So by moving to an outcome, not output-based decision model, healthcare providers can drastically improve procurement. If we continue with the status quo, healthcare will continue to struggle to deliver useful technologies and in the process waste a lot of money. And we see that very, very frequently. So technologies need to work for everyone across patient populations. They need to be accessible. This means language, simplicity, and operability. Technologies need to be implementable, independent of the patient, of the health worker, or the system used. So expecting a patient or a doctor to be the driver of adoption and use, for that matter, is quite a naive approach. Matt mentioned this in his presentation, and I think he's absolutely right. An example of this from our perspective as an adherence technology provider, there's over 5,800 apps on the various app stores, and they've all failed because they haven't moved the needle. They haven't had any meaning or affected any meaningful change within the market as yet. There's small pockets of success, but by and large, these systems or these technologies have failed to hit their target. Patient-driven solutions rarely succeed. Human behavior is peculiar. Patients can be positively negligent about their own well-being, something that we're all familiar with, and something we've certainly discovered at Curaizon. An example of how we need to think about this, and this is a very generic view of it, is Apple don't make 50 different versions of the iPhone. Of course, it's available in different sizes and colors, but fundamentally it's the same technology underneath, and it works for everyone. So at Curaizon, we developed our technology to work across all disease classes and for all patients so as to not limit ourselves. So what should be done? Healthcare providers need to fail early and fail often. This is also known as fail first, fail often. What I mean by this is what's known as kind of a controlled blast radius of impact. This means failing in a small and controlled way to maximize learning to ensure that you're solving the right problem in the right way before you scale. Some of the other presenters have mentioned this or touched on this, and I mirror their thoughts. There's nothing worse than getting the right answer to the wrong question, right? So we've got to try and go about this in the right way. And as Matt mentioned, this is an agile approach of how commercial organizations work, and something that needs to be embraced, we think, within the healthcare sector. So what we're doing by employing this agile approach as a technology company is we're figuring out what doesn't work, and we're doing that rapidly. And this enables quick successive development and brings solutions to market in record time. This is, some of you may also know this as Scrum, as an idea, as a methodology. So the three pillars as we see it for improving this is really around incentivize, collaborate, and innovate. Data-based technologies are especially important because they learn and constantly evolve to become better over time, in the same way that Google searches have become so accurate because there are billions of searches conducted each day. And so for us, this is going to require healthcare organizations to take risks, which is very much outside of their comfort zone, but there are no rewards without risks. So we think that governments and therefore by extension healthcare services need to play a role in helping technology get tested, implemented, and funded. The current responsibility upon companies to find the right procurement pathway and then a viable source of reimbursement, which, by the way, are not always the same thing, this creates a really expensive and unsustainable burden that few companies can afford, so they usually fail. So we think that getting healthcare services to change their procurement model to one focused upon outcomes rather than organizational activity, and doing this at speed so that companies don't go bankrupt in the process, would be a huge step in the right direction. Embracing new technologies and making it a requirement for healthcare professionals to actually use them is also critical, and Matt mentioned the point about integrating this into medical training at medical school level, and we completely agree with that. But these systems need to be implemented so that healthcare professionals don't see this as yet another system, because there's a lot of fatigue within the market where the addition of more and more layers of complexity create problems themselves. So one starting point here would be to create an open API so that all systems use the same language. This is a key success factor. And really, it's how good tech architecture works, and it means that there's also additional support without additional overheads. That's really the end of this for me. As I say, I don't have a great deal of time, so I'd be happy to dig into any of these topics in more detail if people want to reach out to me after today's session. My details are on the last slide, and I believe this will be disseminated by Vanessa afterwards. But thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Nikos. That was an excellent presentation. We actually have here a comment from Miriam that says that was such a great point, like how to define brand and generic digital tools if we can use this as an antidote. How healthcare professionals will be able to compare and decide among solutions tackling the same problem but in different ways. Right.
Yes, it's a very good point, well made, and certainly something that we see also, that we need to empower these healthcare professionals but not overwhelm them, and that's an important takeaway, I think.
And while people are thinking about your great presentation, I do have a question, because on the policy perspective, what we notice is that startups and patients don't actually have a great voice on the development of these policies. And startups are a great driver for innovation. They're starting new things, and patients are the ones who will use the solutions that are being developed. How can we, and you're facing this issue, I'm sure, but how can we improve and raise the voice, increase this voice so that policymakers can actually hear you?
Well, they need to listen, obviously. There is, as I understand it right now, only one framework where this is possible, and this is actually through you guys, where you started to create an environment where people can collaborate and contribute towards new policy decisions overall. It is a very difficult landscape, and I think, sorry to keep referring back to Matt, but as he mentioned, the reception that you get in different markets changes substantially. The interpretation of rules, regulations, licensing, and what what constitutes effectiveness or efficacy is also viewed in different ways by different bodies and different groups in different countries. So I think trying to align those things is one way that we can dramatically improve. Because from an innovator's point of view, you can't afford to develop 50 different solutions. You have to develop one, and it has to be accepted into the wider landscape of healthcare. And so having a unified approach to this, where you've got some fairly, it's what DIGA has tried to do in Germany by creating a sort of a framework. I kind of view them a little bit like if you want to sell your app on the various app stores, you have to comply with Apple and Google's standards of service and technology and security. And once you meet all of those requirements, then you can sell your app via their ecosystems. But in the case of DIGA, they've done precisely that, but it's not the person that's downloading the app that's making the decision, it's somebody else. So you kind of created a barrier for uptake because you created a really clever, streamlined system for integration and reimbursement, but then the person that actually needs it doesn't get a choice over whether they use that. It's actually down to their doctor, and so we see that as quite problematic. So we see one of the ways that to counter this is to make this a part of the delivery of care. So take the decision away from the patient, because as I mentioned, patient-driven solutions rarely succeed. You might get a large uptake in the very early stages, but then patients wane and drop away very rapidly thereafter. And so taking the decision out of the hands of the patient or the healthcare professional, just making it we don't think twice about a prescription. It's just there, it's part of the delivery of care, and it works. We go to the pharmacy, we pick up our drugs. And it needs to be included in such a way that it becomes second nature, or just a part of the delivery of care. So.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll move as to keep on time and track. So I was just going to share my screen again. Just give me a moment. And I think you should be able to see my screen now. So now I'd like to introduce James Anderson. He's the Executive Director of Global Health at IFPMA since January 2021. So he's going almost a year already. He's responsible for leading the work on priorities in global health, and this includes industry policy and advocacy on pandemic preparedness, which is, well, we're still facing it, antimicrobial resistance and global access to medicines and vaccine. He has, prior to working at IFPMA, has lead the role of Head of Corporate Government Affairs at GSK. And he was also a member of the Life Science Strategy Board and Vice Chair Business at OCD, and has made a very important contribution to AMR and AMR policy development at the EHO, UN and EU Commission, as well as national governments, and is also the funding team of the AMR Action Funding. Again, James, thank you so much for accepting to be here in our webinar, and we're looking much forward to your presentation, and I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the IFPMA is the global trade association for innovative biopharmaceutical companies and associations. And I'm going to talk briefly about how we see the role of digital health coming in to support and transform the healthcare system, really building on a number of the the comments and the great presentations already this morning. So we would fully agree that the challenges we face in healthcare today globally really require innovative approaches, and of course digital health and data-driven solutions offer the potential for many step changes across the system. And yet we also would agree that there's a real lag, as Nicholas made very clear. Now, on the positive side, from our perspective, COVID-19 has forced and encouraged quite a lot of change in a short period of time. And we see that as positive, because it's had the impact, or had the result of accelerating the digitalization of healthcare systems around the world in ways that were already starting to happen, but have been stuck due to many of the effects, again, that Nicholas has taken us through. There is a need for appropriate policies and resources to enable this transformation and the benefits to reach those who need them. But there is also the chicken and egg effect that we also very much would recognize. But then finally, I will talk about what the biopharmaceutical industry is doing, and part of that is how we're committed to working with stakeholders to foster the changes particularly in regulatory, but also in policy environments that really will enable the delivery of these benefits to patients and systems around the world. So if we can go to the first slide, Vanessa, please. This is a kind of an overview of how the industry, how the biopharmaceutical industry looks at digital health. And we would share the goals that others have also articulated around creating a more patient outcome focused healthcare system. And that has a number of different elements to it. So first of all, there's a huge potential to optimize R&D processes in clinical trials and accelerate and make more efficient the way that medicines and vaccines and diagnostic tests are developed and made available to patients. Secondly, and we really see this during COVID, but the potential to improve the communications between patients and their providers and expand access is very obvious. In the UK, there's been a lot of, in every country, I'm sure, but certainly in the UK, the move towards online consultations with GPs. It's not universally liked, let's say, by patients, but as we see in the business world, it does really increase the efficiency of the system. You can fit more appointments into the day. It's hard work and it's different to face-to-face interactions, but there, at a practical level, there really are benefits. Thirdly, again, it's been said, but healthcare and improving the quality of care does rely on having the right information available. And in fact, patients have in the past not really been able to access their healthcare records. Again, with COVID, we all see now the obvious example of the vaccine passports, right? It's a specific example, but for me, it is a step change in the way that huge populations across the world now are starting to interact with their own health data and have access to it, however that's being provided. And then finally, the role of real-world data, which does play a very significant role for medicine and vaccine development and delivery, and does enable the ongoing improvements in the way that medicines are used across healthcare systems in different patient populations, sometimes in different indications, sometimes with different strengths or formulations over time, which can really be enabled by real-world data. If we can manage to do all of those things, we really will be able to deliver better access to quality health services, improve the global health security around the world, and foster collaboration across all the different stakeholders, patients, providers, industry in different ways, which can make a meaningful progress toward patient-centered healthcare. And finally, facilitating the innovation that, as we've talked about, to accelerate and make more efficient the R&D and delivery of new medicines. So what's the industry doing? Well, one area that we think that we've been quite active in is diabetes. And you can see the article here that was published by my team earlier in the year, focused on how digital health can concretely make a difference to people living with diabetes. One of my best friends from university has suffered from type 1 diabetes for many years, and over that 30-year period that we've been friends, I've had to help him when he's had a problem with the diabetes. Now, and that's in the UK, where he has full access to insulin, to other medicines, to tests, and everything else. And yet, what he's been able to do in the last few years is have a continual monitoring device for his blood glucose levels. And he tells me this has made a huge difference to his ability to control his sugar levels and therefore improve the way that he is able to manage his disease. So for me, that's a really powerful example of how technology can help patients directly with diabetes. But IFPMA is also a founding member, together with a number of our member companies, of the Be Healthy, Be Mobile initiative. And this is where, both company and civil society-led initiatives which recognize the importance of insulin to diabetes treatment and care, but also the need for the associated diagnostics and delivery devices for safe and effective administration of the insulin and the other medicines and interventions, in particular for type 2 patients who don't only require insulin or don't require it at all. So providing tools, education, training, and so on that can help the patients better manage their own disease across all of those factors really can make a difference. And it does require all stakeholders to work together to make sure that the health system has the capacity to help the patients control the diabetes. So this is also providing tools to healthcare professionals and the training that they need, as well as empowering the patients themselves, but making sure they have the right information, including for not only management of the disease, but prevention and control as well. And in all of these areas, digital health can be a game changer. So we've been working with WHO. This is the centenary year of the discovery of insulin, and the WHO has led a number of initiatives on diabetes as part of that celebration. And we've been working with them on 5 key areas where industry can contribute to improving the way that diabetes patients around the world are cared for. And absolutely, we've been pushing to the scaling up of digital health innovations as one of those key areas. We see a massive role that hasn't still been realized. And as previous speakers have noted, there is a level of frustration with the challenge because that we all see the potential, and yet making progress is hard. On the next slide, I want to just talk about how we see, and this is my last slide, I only have 2, how the industry is thinking about the policies and resources that are needed to deliver these sustainable benefits that we've just talked about. So I think the challenges that, again, Nicholas and Matthew in particular laid out are somewhat inevitable due to the complexity of healthcare systems around the world, due to really all, I think, I'm not going to repeat really what they've said because I think it was captured very well and we would certainly agree with that. But again, when you look at what's happened during COVID, whether it's the move towards e-signatures during clinical trials and even for prescriptions, whether it's e-labeling of medicines, which just, these are very simple, in theory, simple, almost tactical things, but that can make a very significant difference. Remote monitoring of patients in clinical trials, e-submissions to regulatory filings. You know, all of those things are in theory quite straightforward and tactical, but actually make a big difference. And we think that learning the lessons of COVID will be critical to overcome the barriers you know, that we've been discussing here, really. So I'm very pleased to let everyone know that next week during Digital Health Week, we will be releasing for the first time, actually, a set of biopharmaceutical industry principles on digital health, which really explore the current landscape from our perspective and the engagement, the things that industry are doing. It will explore, again, current challenges and barriers that we see, and propose a number of steps forward, which are summarized here in the slide. I think, Vanessa, in the interest of time, rather than going through all of these in detail, because I do feel they've been largely covered by the other speakers, I'm tempted to just pause here, because really what we would look to do would be to share via the mHealth Hub and via Vanessa this set of this publication that when it's coming out next week, and so everyone would be able to you know, to understand where the biopharmaceutical industry is coming from and what we believe are the key things that need to happen in order to continue the progress that's been made under COVID. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, James, for an excellent overview. And again, I think even considering the different sizes of representation that we have here, challenges are similar because we are going through the same sector. And while people are still diving in through your presentation and thinking, I have a question. You mentioned, for example, the word legal flexibility for the pandemic COVID, which allowed to introduce very quickly digital solutions. Do you feel like we still can uptake some of that flexibility and use that lessons to actually show, okay, you had to do this because we needed these solutions, and then show that it has a benefit and impact in managing this pandemic? What are your view? Can we uptake this?
So I think that's a really good question. I think my answer would be yes. I believe that what has been implemented during COVID pretty fast may give us a way to cut through some of the chicken and egg problems that the previous speakers have spoken about, because you know, we've heard that these technology solutions can be created pretty fast. They may not be 100% complete, let's say, at the first point of launch, and certainly you know, again, the UK experience where we've had various tracking and tracing apps during COVID, you know, I would say those are still not working very well, if you believe the reports. But the point is that it has transformed the way that health systems and that population are engaging with some of these tools. And I believe that it's a combination of the regulators allowing these sorts of things to happen in the first place, physicians and then the users both being comfortable with what digital tool can do, but also how it's different to, for example, to a medicine. Because again, I would really agree with how Matthew described those differences. And the you know, part of the challenge we have is that the whole system is set up to fit, if you like, with the paradigm of developing medicines. And medical technology, which means a massive upfront investment and learning exercise through the clinical trials, then a sort of a binary regulatory decision, which means that then once it's approved, in effect, it's then available to everybody. And as Matthew said, really, and we would fully agree with this, what we need to have for these digital solutions to work by and large is quite a different paradigm. And so so I believe that we've managed to achieve that during COVID, and that could help unblock some of the barriers that have been in place up until now.
Thank you so much. For the time reason, I'll let James continue answering the questions on the chat, and I'll pass to the next speaker. So I'd like now to introduce Stefan Vandeput. Is the advisor for digital health and at beMedTech, which is a sector federation that represents the industry of medical technology in Belgium. Stefan has actually a research background. He has a master's degree in electronic engineering, PhD in biomedical engineering. He has held several positions within the industry, and he actually has led several of the activities that imply the industry interactions and tech transfer activities. And he's working at beMedTech since January 2009. Again, thank you so much for accepting to participate in today's webinar, and I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak here and to tell about the industry perspective, specifically towards mHealth frameworks, mHealth assessment frameworks. And I will dive more in detail or focus on mHealth Belgium, as I'm also, the daily operator of the mHealth Belgium portal that probably is known by most of you in the call. The talk today will be especially with my hat as a representative of the industry and how the industry is looking to that. Yeah, you can take the next slide. So very quickly, I will not dive into detail, but mHealth Belgium is a portal that provides information in 3 languages or list apps that fulfill certain criteria that are made by government. So it's the track towards reimbursement for companies, but it is also the way that citizens, patients, and healthcare professionals of all types can find a list of apps that fulfill this criteria on a national level. In the next slide, you see the validation pyramid itself. So there are 3 levels in the pyramid. The first level below is the basis. That's about being medical device, so CE certified medical devices. We only include medical apps, not health apps. So here we already include safety, performance, and clinical evaluation, as this is part of the CE certification. A second layer is more about securely being connected. So this is about ICT criteria. And then the top layer is about being reimbursed, getting financed, and of course showing your social economic evidence. You see also at the left side, we have 3 different authorities, national health authorities, who are involved and who are each responsible for 1 layer. In the next slide, you see an overview of currently what's on the portal. This is 34 apps. 10 of them are already in level 2, but you see none is currently in level 3. In the next slide, I'll take you more from the industry perspective, how those companies that are on our portal and that I'm representing with my federation are looking to mHealth Belgium as a validation pyramid, as a framework. 4 important bullets here, and I take it first from a positive note. It's a very strong framework in the sense that it looks simple and easy, with a clear structure being 3 levels, so a stepwise approach, easy to handle, and also with only hard criteria which are objectively to be evaluated. So there's no subjective interpretation in those criteria possible. Secondly, it's also, as I already mentioned, is the unique path for companies towards financing being reimbursed on the market. And as it is not only a portal for industry, but especially meant to provide information to the broad public, to patients, healthcare professionals, and so on. It's also is to the industry a portal that creates lots of awareness. So often we also say this quality seal that you get if you're listed on a portal. And then lastly, the mHealthBelgium pyramid and the initiative also has a very strong international reputation, being a front runner or being a front runner in the past and maybe still now, but that's a bit under debate. Given the fact that I'm asked to give this type of presentation so broad, so widely in different countries, explains, of course, the strong international reputation the portal has. Then in the next slide, of course, this what I said is a bit the theory. Of course, we also want to see now is theory in line with practice. And in the next slide, of course, it already gives a glimpse that there is a big but. The daily practice is less rosy than the theory, and I want to give you some facts. First, the implementation of the 3 levels has been very slow. So it all started in end of 2018, and the full pyramid only has been activated or implemented. So that means also level 3 and level 2 by beginning of 2021. So that's 2 years or even more for full implementation. From an industry point of view, if companies that were already involved since the beginning, that's of course a huge time, and they had different expectations when it's all started. Then if we look to different levels of the pyramid, in level 1, there is still a big hurdle that there is no clear definition and there are no clear boundaries of what mHealth means. So it has been a political decision or a policy decision in the past to focus on mobile health and not on digital health in the wider sense. But then, of course, the question is, what does mobile mean and what should be mobile? Is a VR application with a medical purpose, is it a mobile health application or not? If you have an interface that is used by the patient, that's as such is mobile, but maybe that component is not being CE certified, but the algorithm in the cloud behind, which have all the intelligence, that's CE certified. So all these issues make that there are still hurdles taken by the authorities, and it's unclear how to handle those, I would say, in the gray zone topics. And we didn't find consensus for a long time. And then regarding level 2, this is what the ICT criteria. Originally, it was the idea to have for all these criteria automated tests so that this process could be automated fully. Nowadays, many of these things still have to be done manually. And then regarding the top level, where everybody, of course, is interested in the financing and reimbursement, here, from an industry point of view, there is a type of a procedure and a template you can use for submission, but there are no real binding timelines. Currently, there is a first evaluation done for cases that submit, and that takes 6 months to see whether this is by an ad hoc work group to see whether this is interesting and useful. But then it all has to start because our payer authority wants to include these mobile health applications in care pods and wants to refinancing the care pods so that it embraces the technology. But this takes a lot of time because it has to be done for every care pod separately, and only when there is a positive advice for a submitted dossier, then they start to rethinking it, and it's unclear from a company point of view how long this will take. So this expectation should be more clear, more transparent, and of course we want the procedures to be faster. Then another point regarding the top level 3, is that we see that there are few, but there are apps reimbursed, though they are not labeled in the pyramid as level 3, which is a bit difficult to explain, but there are different reasons for that. They are granted financing already before the pyramid has been launched or before level 3 has been launched, or sometimes parallel tracks are created. For instance, there is a reimbursement foreseen for telemonitoring of COVID-19 patients, but this is outside of the parallel that it happened. And some got a preliminary reimbursement, and then it's also not seen as a full level 3 app. So this is a bit confusing, of course, and not very transparent. And then finally, the authorities, the payer authority, also seemed not to fully rely on what already happened in level 2, and this is I was active in the discussions where reimbursement files had been evaluated the last couple of months, and most of the discussions went back to not the topic of the app itself, but specifically to what's happening with data, questioning who is owning the data, also about integration, how much integration should be, how much interaction should there be with electronic health records, and so on, which are of course generic questions, which are more related to what's already in level 2 and the ICT criteria that comes with level 2. But in the next slide, I don't want to be only negative or critical. After some long discussions the previous months, I can also tell positively that we find it an agreement since last week between the authorities and the industry federations for the next 2 years to continue, and in that agreement we solve different of the issues that I tackled above. And we also will do a large communication campaign to patients, to citizens, to healthcare professionals, though only in 2023. So we still have to wait for more than 1 year. In the next slide, I want to share just some feeling, some gut feeling by the industry about how they look to the authorities, to the government. And you have to know first, of course, that it all started with the previous ministry. So now we have another ministry. And currently we see that there is no hard or clear, sharp vision on digital health, and no real hard push, of course, because all focus of this Ministry of Public Health is already since the beginning on the COVID crisis. The authorities also see it often as a task, a task with hurdles, and not seeing all the opportunities that can come along with these applications. And often there is also lots of conservatism, so there's not the progressive thinking. Given, for instance, the example that they want to see first all evidence on a large scale instead of the use and evaluate approach, which already has been discussed, and coming back to the paradox that Matt alluded on. And often we see also rather a fear for change, a fear for the unknown. And in the discussions I had as an industry federation with the authorities, this often was my takeaway, I'd say. They point out to digital literacy, are healthcare professionals or patients willing to use it, what would be the financial impact? And therefore, I think being a front runner, we slightly lose momentum that we already created in Belgium, though with the new agreement last week with the authorities, maybe we can take it back if we change some things. In the next slide, I also want to look a bit abroad, because the companies I represent are also not only looking to the Belgian market, of course, but also more internationally. And I want to slightly compare with what's happening in Germany with DIGA, in France that will copy DIGA after the EPTA program that they installed. If you look to Germany, and of course there's a bit of the contrast with what I said before, the implementation has been done much faster. I think less than 6 months after the announcement, it has been fully in place. We also see there more a real push from the government, from the ministry, which creates, of course, a stronger drive. And to my knowledge, there are not so much discussion on the boundaries. They are a bit more broad about digital therapeutics, digital health applications, not only focusing on mobile health. And if you look to the outcome after they exist now 1 year, the evaluation processes are much faster, and they allow also the preliminary listing, so being on the market while reimbursed and gathering your evidence. And that's a bit why I said here the entire world is looking to this approach, because it's a approach that embraces innovation and it's progressive and doesn't see only the hurdles. In the next slide, the next slide is meant to compare the both, and especially towards the facts, the outcome. So towards in the Belgian system, we had, let's say, about 50 that submitted, and not all made it to the pyramid. In Germany, they are already, and this is information very recently, from only I think 1 week ago, that I took from their portal. They have 106 applications, many for provisional listing, which we don't have in Belgium, and then already 30 for full final listing. And in the next slide, you see what then the outcome is. So from the 106 already currently, there are 24 who has a positive decision, and another 24 who are being evaluated, being processed. If you compare this with our Belgian pyramid, it's 50, it's less, but we have also less, I think, awareness about it in the industry world. And then 34 made it in level 1, 10 in level 2, but still non-officially in level 3. Because we don't do also this preliminary listing. By the way, there is one who has been preliminary listed, but we don't mention it as a level 3. So we also don't create in Belgium some success stories where in Germany you see there's a lot of fuzz about it, but it also helps because things move around very fast. In the next slide. In the next slide and in a few slides, I want to come to some guidance, to a call. It initiates with a mHealth Europe position paper that I contributed to, and which has been launched only 10 days ago. And in that, we especially look to how digital health and assessment frameworks should work to embrace innovation and funding. And there are 6 recommendations that the paper and that I'm doing. And first one, and you will see that some of them are aligned with the previous speakers, of course. First is about ensure transparency. So you should have structured, stable, and transparent criteria that are tailor-made. Secondly is also link it with funding. So assessment frameworks for digital health or mobile health applications should be explicitly linked with funding. Funding in different ways can be reimbursement, can be coverage, any type of financing. Thirdly, consider the value. The assessment framework should consider a holistic benefit. So not only look to the cost effectiveness or the savings that are possible, but also to other things and other aspects that digital health applications or mobile health applications can bring. Think about increasing accessibility of care, quality of life, efficiency of care, and so on. So consider the bigger picture of what you can call value. And then in the next slide, the last 3 ones. Fourth one, share learnings. And this is what this mHealth Hub also wants to do. This is what I also with this presentation tries to do. It's not about being only critical about the mHealth Belgium and being positive about DIGA. It's also about share learnings. We were front runners. We were in the beginning, so we also can use the learnings from what went good and bad. So that other member states, countries can learn from that and can implement the best possible thing. Fifth one is support evidence generation. And here it is important that the requested evidence should be appropriate related to the impact of the app itself. And we don't have to look only to randomized clinical trials. And I think the evidence was spot on what Matt said and the paradox. So a law being on the market while creating evidence is crucial for this type of software applications. And then finally, and I think the previous speaker also alluded on this, it's not about only investing in the applications, in the technology itself, but also investing in infrastructure and training for the clinicians, patients, caregivers. They should be educated, and also infrastructure, because often these digital health tools generate data, and this data has to be shared and communicated with the different actors in the healthcare system around the patient. So also this infrastructure, and then of course the things that Danny alluded on about interoperability are of course very crucial. With that, I think I am the end of my presentation, and now open to questions, of course.
Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. Oh, I think there's a feedback. Okay, it's better. I'll just take some questions because we are running a little bit late. There's a question for Mark here that says, are continuously evolving, getting new functions. How do you address this in the mHealth Belgium?
That's a good point. That's something we also discuss with our authorities, because I think it's especially on the level 3 that it has to be discussed, and we are still in the early phase of listing the first reimbursed or financed apps. But it's good indeed that we think, because they are so fastly evolving. On the one hand, the procedures have to be fast to evaluate them, and secondly, of course, we have also to see when the functionality change, whether this can have impact on the pricing itself, which is of course a responsibility not of the operator of such a portal, but of course of the authority that is linked with it.
Great. And there's another question that says DIGA is being moved from HIH, which to be honest, I don't know what it is, to the ministry BFRM. Is this a positive signal?
Yeah, knowing very well the Belgian healthcare market, but less the different institutions in the German system, it's difficult for me to answer, sorry.
Okay, well, maybe Mark can explain better the question. I was also going to ask, because we are running a little bit late, if our speakers and Mario will agree to move to the discussion session without having the break.
For me, it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. Perfectly fine.
Fine by me also.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I apologize to the audience. We'll skip the 5 minutes break and we'll pass to our discussion session, which I know you are very excited to hear. And I'm going to pass the floor to Mario. Mario is the head of IoT and digital health at Ericsson. Nikola Tesla is actually another institution partner of the European mHealth, and he's going to conduct a very excellent discussion. We are all very excited to hear. Thank you so much, Mario.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thanks to all the speakers. I was listening carefully, and basically we have a lot of insightful information for a 5-hour discussion, I would say, but we need to squeeze it in 10, 15, 20 minutes so that we let everybody else after the 12th to move to the next meeting. So I particularly liked, Dennis' interoperability focus, Matthew's focus on evidence, and then funding and education, Nicholas's startup approach, James's view on global health, and Stephen's all details about mHealthBelgium. But if we look from industry perspective, and let's be a little bit industry focused right now here, because I'm coming from the industry as well. If we want to create an mHealth industry in Europe, and if we want to be relevant in that industry, not for the fact that 60% of IT industry in healthcare is in the US alone in the world. So we need to create a market for it, I think, and we need to let the industry innovate faster, as we all addressed. We have not seen that, as Matthew pointed out, the ecosystem is complex, more complex than pharmaceutical business ecosystem, and it's really hard to be fast, in that area. So let me try to steer this in a manner. I'll shoot a question, and let's do like a 1 minute answer, and then we can wrap it up and have a joint discussion. So what do you think? One by one, let's start with Danny, who started his presentation first. What are the main industry uptake obstacles you see on the EU market? Is it reimbursements and procurement, like hard elements, or adaptation, education, the soft elements most dominant? And are the differences between countries huge that you see?
Well, certainly, I think each of the speakers has touched upon particular aspects of the barriers that there are. But I think for many that are active within mHealth, they first of all focus on their local markets. So even while we're discussing kind of European harmonization approach, quite clearly, for many, their main focus first is on the national market. And that's why we need, of course, those kind of policy discussions. I'm not sure which speaker that put it forward, but we need to have this kind of legal policy area that enables the approach, so that allows you to develop such a solution. And then, of course, going to market is a big aspect. Even within healthcare, for companies, we're talking small and medium companies mostly. They need to have a viable solution. It needs to be sustainable. So it's not easy for them to develop this and then try and generate evidence for 3 years. before they get to the process of trying to be reimbursed. So we need to kind of come up with innovative payment models, as we see, for instance, with DIGA, where you can already have temporary acceptance, and then we need to further work with the community, with stakeholders, and I think there are certain tools that can be further used or integrated. We now, for instance, have a published ISO standard that looks into how to communicate on the safety and reliability of mHealth apps, which can be a useful tool, I think, over time as well, to try create more awareness. And then at the same time, we need to find a kind of in-between level where we see, for instance, that ORCA or also other more national or regional initiatives are coming up with a kind of list of trusted or accredited mHealth apps that give a high level of confidence to the healthcare professionals as well.
Danny, differences between countries, huge or small within EU? Is everybody slow or some are progressing faster? What is your opinion?
There are huge differences, and it's mainly what I said, because all healthcare systems are built locally, and the level of centralization of these processes as well as procurement is also quite central as to how easy it is to have uptake. If you have, like I believe Matt mentioned, or Nicholas, if you have 12 different procurement processes or divisions that you need to address within one country, it's of course much more complex than if you have one central authority to work by.
Hard obstacles like regulatory and procurement versus soft obstacles like education adaptation. Yeah. What would you say is the major barrier? Hard or soft?
Well, I think we first need to tackle the hard. That's the easy one. We know what the issues are there. We need to come to a kind of consensus. What is the minimum requirements and safeguards we need to put a framework in place, and then we need to work on the soft as well, on the skills and the education and transparency.
Thanks, Danny. Matt, what's your point of view on the both questions?
Yeah, so thanks very much. So I thought maybe just reflect on some examples that we've seen. So the first example I would say is the electronic medical record uptake in the United States. Now, once that became mandated, there was an explosion of uptake. So if we really want to drive an mHealth market, you can do it from the top, and you can create pathways, and you can create mandates that say you have to deliver this. So that's one. The second thing is, let's see what we talk about with COVID, because COVID, as many speakers have identified, was a huge driver for the uptake of digital health solutions. And you know, when people are forced to change, they change, they adapt, they cope, and things are fine. So I think if we feel that this is an important area, and let's start with that assumption, then we can do hard changes that mandate that people do this, and that's what will drive the market fast enough.
Thank you very much. Has anybody heard about the Swedish company called Cry? K-R-Y. So you know, if you monitor the startup health market and investments in digital health worldwide, this is the first year where US company is not the leader in investment levels. This is the UK-based company for robotic surgery. They received $600 million of investment, and Curaizon, the telemedicine company from Sweden, received $300 million of investment. So that's one of the indicators if things are possible, and COVID is basically the enabler for them to, you know, raise so much money on telemedicine service. So I agree fully, Matt, on COVID, and I think, you know, the first point I liked very much, because I'm, despite, you know, life in Europe from industry perspective, I'm very much of a fan of American decision making. We need to make it very straight, and we need to make it from the top. So to enable the industry, then we all prosper on the long term.
Mario, can I just make a comment on what you said there about the funding? So I think the funding is super interesting, but I personally think in the UK we have a huge problem with having very innovative companies, with having a really kind of early stage ecosystem that's strong, and then all these companies move to the United States. So that we need to stop, and we need to create a market for these companies in Europe. Otherwise, they will go to the US.
Exactly.
But I would jump in and say, in addition to that, Matt, that this comes down to the regulatory requirements. Naturally, any company trying to survive will find the most cost-effective market. So, as you mentioned, I think, and Matt, that the lowering of the bar and the reduction in regulatory requirements, you're just going to go for the low-hanging fruit or the easiest entry point. And the US has largely created that, right? That they don't have too much interference from a regulatory point of view in the same way. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that my fear is that we'll start to see the success of what's happening with in Belgium and in Germany, and that the EU will say, okay, we're going to mandate this across the entire continent. But one of the things that the EU is really good at doing is adding masses of unnecessary complexity. The bureaucratic nature of the beast means that this will become a very bureaucratic process, and that'll actually make things worse. So it's a very difficult thing to know what the best solution is and the right way to take this. So, but I would echo the thoughts of, and especially James, you mentioned this a lot in your presentation, that one of the things that did come out of, if anything positive came out of COVID, it was that health services learned to communicate, because the problem historically has always been that there are these silos of decision making. There's also silos of funding, and never the twain shall meet. They never spoke to one another. They never collaborated for certain. And so when it was decided that we have to do this, and come hell or high water, you are going to communicate with each other. You're going to break down the barriers and actually figure out how to make this work. They did it really quickly, and I've got a lot of people that work in this industry that were utterly surprised at what they could achieve in a relatively short amount of time with relatively small amounts of funding when they actually communicated.
Okay.
So I think that's something that we need to think about.
Thanks, Nicholas. James, what's your perspective on hard versus soft barriers and enablers for industry in the EU market?
Yeah, so if you step back and ask the question, what advantages can Europe have, and are we leveraging them? I would say at a European level that the key advantage is the regulatory system. Certainly within the medical side, the EMA is a world-class regulator. It's quite progressive, and that is one of the areas that Europe has the potential in digital to be world leading, right? But that's not enough, and the previous points make it very clear, because the reimbursement and the adoption, the markets themselves will always be national level, and the data that underpins so much of this will also be national or even subnational in a number of countries now. But I would say on the data side, again, there is the potential for countries that have national health systems, such as the UK, but others as well. They're sitting, there is a sort of treasure trove that's treasure trove of potential there. What I think hasn't been really worked out is the strategy that Europe wants to adopt around both of those possible areas of strength. And so it feels like there's a lot of activity, but there's not enough focus on what I would say are those two things where there is an opportunity here for Europe really to compete with the US. But I don't think we are. It's not easy, but I would say at this point, I don't think we're winning, right?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Can I just formulate another question from the discussion we had? Based on your experience in Belgium, what is needed for Belgium to be the most successful mHealth? Okay.
I think it's clear, and you pointed out in the beginning of this debate. What is the key issue? Is it funding and financing or adoption? And for me, those goes hand in hand. And it's not that funding or financing will follow adoption, but it's the other way around. There need to be financing, and then adoption will clearly follow. We have seen this in within the healthcare, for instance, and I think Matt already mentioned it. Using electronic health record systems and EPDs and so on, the government invested in it. It became obliged, and then it has been adopted widely. And it should also be the case for to embrace digital health technologies. And I think, especially with COVID, the mindsets are ready. I mean, if we use this with the healthcare professionals and the patients to use them, but of course the government should also invest in it and push it forward.
Okay, so it reminds me to Obamacare and accountable care organizations in the States, where they reimbursed healthcare providers for having less readmissions after heart surgeries, and therefore buying remote patient monitoring solutions, the 2013-14, right? So we need some kind of a enabler, forced enabler to open the funding, to open the market, and then basically, after we do solve the hard factors, we should focus on a longer term on soft factors. As you mentioned, Matthew, my own experience as a physician, takes quite a lot of time to educate doctors about digital tools, change the pathways from analog path after you leave the physician to digital path for you as a patient, etc., etc. So if I may sum it up correctly, and please do everybody do the final word from your side. For us, for Europe to be the leader in mHealth on a global level, let's think about that. And I think it's possible, because nobody is still a leader in mHealth on a global level. So it's possible. And for our companies to become relevant, like Cry became relevant on the list of the new startups, and some other companies are really there, starting to jump in. What do we need to do? Do we need like top-down decision, as you said, Matthew, use COVID and do the funding stuff on EU level, on a country's level immediately, or are there some other things that you would like to prioritize? So each one of you, 1 minute, please.
Shall I start?
Yeah, please.
I think what funding will always be, and financing in healthcare nationally appointed. But what really can help is that evidence that can be generated, that there is a harmonized approach, that not every country decides differently what's needed to get reimbursement in their country, and that we have there on a European level among all member states a unified approach, what type of evidence is needed for digital health applications, and make it appropriate to the fact that software is fastly evolving and so on.
Thank you very much. James?
Thanks. I mean, in a way, I answered that question already with my previous answer, I think. But I think one other area where Europe has led the world is in data protection and ethical use. And I think it's clearly a complex area, but I think that the EU does have a good track record here of setting the standards that then the rest of the world follows. So I think that's certainly, from the industry perspective, we do see that as critically important. We've published some principles on what we believe are the key principles around ethical use of data, and that won't in itself sort of build the industry directly, but I think for the industry here in Europe to be part of the way that those standards and frameworks are set up, and making sure that all the protections are in place, and the patients and healthcare systems can trust the way that the data is used, that in itself actually will create an advantage, and we can be, pretty sure that other parts of the world will also follow in terms of what the EU sets as those standards.
agree completely. It's not sexy as industry might understand at the beginning, but it's hardly needed for sustainability, because after 5 years, if people cannot trust where I'm using their data, I'm in a problem. So it's for a long term, sustainability is extremely important. Thank you, James.
Sorry, I have to drop off for another call, but I really appreciated the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Nicholas, in short.
Yeah, very shortly, I would say we need to look at regulation very carefully. So trying to find something that is interoperable across countries is a good idea, but we need to not go too deep into the woods or into the weeds with this. A really good example being, as James, who's just left us, mentioned, the European Medicines Agency do a tremendous job, but what we've seen across Europe in the last decade or so being largely protectionist in its application, it has imposed tariffs on international pharmaceuticals coming into Europe, which has led to European pharmaceuticals actually reducing substantially their research and development budget. So they've created an environment that is protectionist, so that they can continue to dominate in these markets. And what we don't want to do is see the same kind of thing appear across the technology market, where that we create barriers for other international brands and technologies to come into the sphere. So interoperability, simplification of the regulatory frameworks, I think, are really key to make it as easy as possible for companies to enter into the system without too much burden in terms of time, cost, and so on.
Thank you. Danny, your final words.
Yeah, I also would like to reiterate the comments from Stephen and from Nicholas. I mean, if you talk about scale, you cannot grow a whale in a fishbowl. So you need to have a bigger market. And what we see certainly for these SMEs is not only the multitude and the complexity of the hurdles they need to step through for the different markets, but at the same time as well, they need expertise on this, and that is missing as well. So a sort of more unified framework where, let's be realistic, you will always have a divide from the national competence and the more EU competence, and harmonization may be difficult, but at the same time, we should look towards a kind of minimum level of agreements, mutual recognition, reuse of evidence that has been generated within EU or documentation, to further streamline the processes for the company, so that at least their time to market is reduced, and the cost as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matt, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And just want to say thank you very much for being involved in this. It's been a very interesting couple of hours. So a couple of things. First one, I think funding. I think there are two elements to that. We need to enhance the ICT infrastructure. There's been a chronic underinvestment there, and that's something we can prime the pump with and correct. The second thing is then we need to create ways to get reimbursement for these products, and that needs to be clear pathways that we can follow. Next is around evidence. Yes, I kind of feel everyone pushing against regulation. Having said that, regulation is there to protect patients. So for me, it's about having clear evidence standards that we know what we need to do, and that I don't mind doing studies. I enjoy doing the clinical studies, but I need to know what I need to do. And then finally, probably the softer things, which are probably the harder things, we need to start early in upskilling and informing clinicians about what the benefits of these things are. So I'll probably leave it there, and yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you all. It has been really a pleasure to have this discussion. Although, as I said, I think we could have this discussion for 5 hours, and we are 9 minutes already over our time. Thank you all participants for a very, I could see, active discussion in the chat. And Vanessa, please, up to you to close the meeting.
Yeah, I was just going to use your own words. Thank you once again for everyone to joining our session, the audience, and of course our speakers and Mario. This has been a very interesting discussion with, as I mentioned, different sectors, different realities with very common problems, and without raising these awareness on these, we will never advance. So I think this is very important, and we hope with this project to continue to help. And I'll just ask for a modern picture, which is a print screen of screen, if you don't mind, just a quick print screen, if you can all just smile. Thank you so much. And again, okay, I'll take one with Belay, which is from our team. And with this, I'll just wrap up our session. This will be available pretty soon in the Hub platform. And thank you so much for being here today. Have a good day, everyone.
All right,
Thank
enjoy
you.
the day.
All the best. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.